Beth Rudden is the CEO of Bast AI. Beth, welcome to Untangled.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm pretty excited to be here.
So the dominant paradigm in AI right now seems to be that we need ever more data, ever more compute to build ever bigger models. But there are a number of alternative paradigms. Instead of improving the model by throwing more data at it, we could instead try to improve the data. Talk about how this data centric approach to AI differs from the scale at all costs approach we seem to be hurtling towards.
I have so many stories, and I love this question. I've been immersed in data most of my life, and I remember in 2012 we started a data science profession in IBM, and it was me, a statistician, and a mathematician, and I was the social scientist. And I kept watching all of these data scientists. They would just take whatever data they had and sort of shove it at an algorithm and see what happened, and then be like, it's 97% accurate. I'm like, against what? And it was so interesting because I was like, I think that we need to really really consider the fact that data is an artifact of human experience. um, I I always thought about it in the sense that, somebody made a choice, somebody made a decision, and then I was rewarded with that kind of thinking most of my career, because when AI systems like detect patterns, which they're very good at detecting patterns, but they really suck at knowing which pattern matters. And so data is a decision or an evidence, an artifact, or a belonging of some human being that made that decision, right? So how could we not want to see what kind of data that we need to be able to be put in? And the realm of generative AI and the world that we have in today is outstanding, but it could be so much better if we really sanitized our inputs, understood the data that we're putting in, and then really put data at the forefront. And I am not by any means the only scientist who is talking about this. Ing says we need small, high quality data. There's thick data, there's warm data, there's, all kinds of things that are coming out where people are like, hey, this kind of matters because it's personal. It's the decision of somebody who that data belongs to.
Right. I mean, one of the massive assumptions underpinning the sort of current AI paradigm isn't just that more data plus context equals intelligence. It's that decontextualized data contains meaning, right? But it doesn't. It carries patterns and associations, but meaning and knowledge is made through, to your point, the interactions between people and systems. Whereas I would imagine in healthcare, when patients, caregivers, and researchers interact with clinical knowledge, they are generating a record of how humans actually try to understand medical information. And that interaction and the sort of meaning that's being made in that moment isn't captured by the AI tools we have that are sort of predominant today. So I'd be curious, talk about the difference between decontextualized data and
Mhm.
interaction data and all of the sort of invisible frictions alive in the healthcare context.
Starting back when I was a wee archaeologist, and I'd pull an artifact out of the ground and it'd be like, what does this mean? Who put it there? How do we know that this person put it there for that purpose at that reason? And the joke in archaeology is that if you don't know what something is, well, then it was obviously religious. And so then you would put, some ritual around it, or, you would make up something that was in your imagination. And that is decontextualized data, is that it tells you more about the person who found the artifact or who is talking about the artifact. Fast forward in my world, to like the early 2000s, when we would have IT, or your technology teams were the ones that they would take the data, they would store the data, they would say, this data goes in this table and means this thing. And that was so divorced from the meaning of the person who made the decision to call the help desk and have a problem at that time, or whatever it was. And so again, that tells you more about the IT people, the engineers that put the data into the systems than it does tell you about the data. So again, decontextualize. When you leave the data with the context and with the source, then that has meaning in a way that the human being that made the choices to create that data at that moment in that time, then that changes how they have the relationship to it. So in the medical context, and we're doing some work with outpatient procedures and outpatient training. And we know that 70% of human beings don't really understand the outpatient procedures. And that's not insignificant, because I mean, how many of you have gone home with a bunch of paper that you're like, what the hell do I do? I take my pills 2 times a day, but this one every, third hour, and like you're trying to figure out like how to do all this stuff. And it gets even worse if that is not your natural language. And a lot of the work that I do, I try to center around how does somebody want to receive the information and how can we best interpret or take information and generate a way for that human being to map it to what they already know so that they can receive the information in a way that they need to receive it. Basic things like in Spanish or in Vietnamese or in the language that, they need to see something really important like outpatient procedures. And so in this work, what we're realizing is that the way that people are interacting and the questions that they ask, there's no way to generate that kind of organic questioning or misunderstanding or wanting to know whatever it is that people want to know. And the more that we start to see, and by the way, the many tools, in fact, most tools should log how people are asking questions. And the fact that most of us are not seeing that likely means that that is being logged and that is being tracked and that is being harvested, because that's the payment for access to the free tool. So it's we're the if the tool is free, then you're typically the product. So in this case it holds true. But what we do at Bast is we show the hospital administrators and even the individual people, look at all the questions that you're asking and look at all of the things that we're starting to learn. And these are just really basic things like, hey, my husband has a traumatic brain injury. We're in week 6. He's a Ranchos Los Amigos score X. And what do we do? And is this normal? And that question of this normal is probably the most critical thing that you can do for another human being in a healthcare situation, is be like, you're not alone. Of course this is normal, in the sense that here's 3 other people who looked like you or looked like your husband, and this is what they were thinking and asking and talking about in week 6. So you have that lineage and provenance of knowledge, that the output of the AI system that you're receiving through our AI systems is not only legitimate, genuine, it has applicability to what you need to know, because other human beings in your situation are asking the very same thing. And it's funny because, like, Charlie, how do we get people to really remember what it's like to get real genuine information? It feels better.
It does feel better. Yeah, when you can understand it, when you can understand its context, when you can understand where
Yeah.
it's coming from and why. Like, we're all just sort of awash in a sea of decontextualized information and being asked to make sense of it on our own.
Well, that's why, I mean, I go back and I read books and read books that were written
What?
before.
You read okay.
But
Yeah.
like and I think most of us know this or should know this, is like you can go back and read the same book and it has different meaning because you've changed. And you're the interpretive filter, you're the infrastructure. And so what I want to get back to is where human beings are the infrastructure to, and AI is the magical ability to now translate that into somebody with an eighth grade education, or to translate that into somebody who is in shock and has to figure out what to do next. That clear, concise, current. We have these words that it feels so refreshing to know how somebody, or how, in our case, like how something is getting the answer, and then be able to then trust that that system that you're interacting with is giving you information that on it's not even on script, that it is it's relevant and it's genuine. And this idea that we can statistically kind of measure this, there's so much fallibility in that. And I remember putting chatbots into production, and the users would tell us that this answer is 100% correct. It's accurate, it's right, everything is 100% exactly what they needed. And we'd look at in the model, and the model was saying, well, this answer is only 60% accurate, or since 60%, correct. And that's where there's a huge distance between how somebody receives information and how somebody thinks it should be received, who might not be in that context.
Yeah. I mean, this starts to get at the sort of ontology of it all, right?
Yeah.
And, an ontology is an explicit, structured representation of concepts, their properties, and their relationships within sort of a specific field of knowledge. And so, if I understand sort of what you're doing correctly, you're building a sort of structured map that says, okay, here are the concepts that exist in this domain. Here's how they connect to each other. Here's where each piece of knowledge sort of sits relative to everything else. Talk a little bit about what that looks like in the context of healthcare and why it matters.
Yeah, so my husband is a medevac pilot, and I remember I we moved to Dothan, Alabama, when I was 8 months pregnant with our first child, and we he was studying, because Dothan is where they call it Mother Rucker, where they train Fort Rucker, where they train all of the Army pilots. And my parents lived in Lakeland, Florida, so we would, pop the baby in the back of the car, and then we would be driving down from Alabama to Florida. And my husband always had to learn everything that he needed to know to become a pilot. He had to learn it verbatim, and not like kind of know it, like actually know it, down to the pauses, the periods, the commas, everything. Like, these are the wind conditions, these are the measurement conditions, these are the, all of the things that you need to know. And they called it chapters 5 and 9 of like the Army manual. And so we would like be, rehearsing his 5 and 9s on the way down. And I'm always like, can't you just get a C? Why do you need to get like an A? Why do you need to know this verbatim? Could you please put, because like under your wings, there's no grade, right? But you've
Well,
never
as
been a
a
pilot.
passenger, I appreciated that he went for that A.
Yes, well, we actually had lots of fun. Anyway, that's a digression. But my point was that and he's a medevac pilot, and as a pilot in any kind of like emergency situation, it's not the time to make shit up. So you need to understand things from like a muscle memory standpoint. And so, 23 years later, I'm, making artificial intelligence using protocols that people have written, and it's not like they've written them. They've also had hundreds of thousands, millions of people memorize these protocols, all the way down to like when you were a kid, your hip bone connects to your thigh bone. Like, so you have all of these knowledge, this knowledge, right? And it's embodied knowledge when you're connecting that information, and then you're doing the information verbatim so that you have like that muscle memory for that emergency situation. And so what we're doing with A is making those protocols available to people who don't, have the training and have not gone through a lot of that, because it is good, high quality information that we know for fact that your hip bone connects to your thigh bone, like for fact. And so those are what we determine as facts, and we use those as ground truth. and that is truth because it's factual information in a representation or a graphical representation, and we use a formal knowledge graph called an ontology. The philosophical side of ontology is as you described, it's really the study of the nature of your reality. And your reality is made up of symbols and what you hear and what you see and all of the different senses that we have, but the words that we use also truly define how we think about things and in our own reality. So, giving an AI a contextual frame or a cognitive scaffolding or a model of the hip bone connects to the thigh bone kind of information, that's giving the AI system a fact to be able to understand against. And I think a lot of people, because of the way that AI systems are built and the atrocious the personalization and the anthropomorphism, which is a big word that means that you are ascribing human like activities to an object. I mean, all of that is built in a way to activate our little Paleolithic brain to try to create a shared reality with the system that does not understand the meaning of your words because it doesn't have context to understand against. And when we have conversation, like Charlie, we're in conversation right now, we're creating meaning like between the two of us, and I'm like, is this what you think? Yes, this is what I think. Like that's creating meaning, that's creating an ontology, that's creating a agency, sense making, that's creating a complex adaptive system just in this moment. And when we are interacting with an AI system, it's almost tragic because human beings are trying to create meaning and that's
Right.
our nature. That's how we are built. Is we're social animals. We have to. There is no objective reality inside my own head. I think everybody's been through that. You're not the thoughts in your head kind of thing. Or if you haven't,
If
welcome
you
to the
haven't tried
party.
meditating, it's fantastic. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Meditation there's a whole universe inside, but it's not objective. That's only one kind of point of view. We interact with other things and other people, and we have like our self to world, self to text, self to other people. Like this is how we create shared reality, and that requires context to have meaning against. So I circled around a lot there, but I hope I kind of like really drew in this idea that understanding, it's a labor. It requires tension, it requires context, or it requires something to understand against. Without that, you don't have true understanding. You have statistical appropriation.
No, you said it really well. I mean, if I'm hearing you right, it's that our own ontology is implicit, it's sort of distributed, it's embodied, it's constantly being revised through our own experiences. And so, is it fair to say that you're sort of trying to make explicit what
Mhm.
humans carry implicitly and sort of making it shareable, traceable, and stable enough to ground AI systems that have no implicit version at all?
That's right. That's right. And we use small data to do it because it's small, high quality, again, memorized by millions of people type of data, and then making that relevant to the people with the context who are like, okay, I broke my spine here. These are the things that are happening. Again, back to anatomy, physiology, what we understand by science. And it can even be, and a friend of mine reminded me of this recently, is that it can even be like a pseudonym or a euphemism, and understanding that I did a big reskilling and upskilling when I was in IBM, and it was the best thing that I've ever done in my life, is to really show people that they already have all of these skills, but they don't have the names for it. And so a mom with 4 kids under 10, she has conflict resolution. Hands down.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? Like she has negotiation, she
Yeah.
has supply chain, she has like all of these skills, right? But she might not know that vocabulary. And what a gift to give people, a vocabulary for something that you already do and already have. And, that's where I really do see the work that we do with AI and the creation of these ontologies as Rosetta Stones. So, you might call it this, but I'm going to call it that. And that's tomato, tomato. That's the essence of bridging that understanding to, yeah, we both agree that it tastes real good on spaghetti.
Yeah.
That's something that I think is so human, and it's not. AI could be so much more, will be so much more, and we're at the beginning, the floppy disk era of AI.
Well, backing up for a moment, I'd be curious to hear, like, what's the origin story of Bast AI, and why did you really decide to focus on the ontology of it all?
I've been after this like every good person. I've been doing this in one way, shape, or form for a very long time. And I grew up in IBM. I got to be everything that I ever wanted to be and became like the chief data officer of the $34 billion GTS or managed services division.
That's a lot of
Got to be in a
dollars.
it's a lot of dollars. A lot of people got to upskill and reskill the workforce, got to roll an entire company off as, Kyndryl, which is a whole new company, and be in the room where that some of that happened and be part of the teams, did Spectre Meltdown and GDPR and like all of these incredible things. And then in my last 2 years, I really started to think about the fact that it's difficult to innovate in a large organization, and I maybe other people don't do it, but I was carrying a lot of knowledge in my brain where it was a tax, like who did what to who had what to what position. It's the politics, the art of the possible, as Bismarck would say, on in large corporations, and that tax sort of makes you get into these routines where it's difficult to innovate or to build in the way that I wanted to build. And so I did my last 2 years, ran two P&Ls, learned go to market, learned all of the things, and then started my own company and realized how much I did not know and how the world is always so much bigger and so much smaller than I think people realize. But I started Bast in October of 22, and I wanted a four-letter domain because Bast.ai is pretty easy to understand. The word Bast has multiple meanings. It is the fibrous part of a plant that delivers nutrients from the soil to the plant. So that's a lot of what we do as a layer. We deliver good high quality data. And so I think that, the other thing is I wanted an AI protector, and Bast is also the Egyptian cat goddess. So 10,000 years ago, the Egyptians like worshipped Bast and Bastet. And I've always had an affinity for cats and cats and the internet and Schrodinger's cat and all of the things, but like multiple meanings, multiple things, but really it's that I wanted people to know that there's an alternative to Black Box AI, and there's an alternative to AI systems that are made by brute forcing, using large amounts of data and large amounts of compute. And I've never liked this idea that you have to use more than what you would need. And that that comes from growing up in a place where we never had budget. We never had like we could access a mainframe, but we would have to pay for it, so everything that we did always had a cost. And so you knew your total cost of ownership or your full life cycle management. And, these are it's not, it would have been dreamy at one point to, get a pile of money dumped on me and just say, build whatever you want. But that was not my privilege. And so it's like, I've always been one of those people that I'm like, I love necessity because it really does allow you to innovate in ways that you haven't innovated. I think about the story behind Google, and they didn't have big honking machines. They didn't have mainframes. They didn't have, lots and lots of compute. So they had to figure out how to create HDFS or Hadoop file systems in order to be able to store lots of data. And they have a mother node that determines, oh, okay, hey, I'm going to make my toaster part of this distributed compute system. How much load can my toaster hold? So not literally, but in that vein, that you kind of like string distributed compute, and I'm like, that completely changed everything that we're doing. Distributed systems and distributed information. And so what I'm doing with Bast and what we're doing with ontologies, this dates back to the W3C standard, Tim Berners-Lee, Marvin Minsky, entity extraction, RDF, and like all of the standard that is out there. When you choose to use a standard, you inherit all of the information and all of the work that people have been doing because they've written it into a standard, and it's an open source standard. And so we tend to pick up a lot of different things like that because we have very good taste in what works and what doesn't. And using an ontology to store a cognitive scaffolding for an AI system, everyone is talking about it, at least in my bubble.
Yeah.
And it seems logical, I hope, for
I
people.
mean, I both appreciate the point that, constraints sort of create creativity,
Mhm.
and ingenuity. And also, if someone did dump a bunch of money in your lap, you'd then have to spend all of your time sort of propagating these like hype-y narratives
Mhm.
of godlike AI in order to, generate those returns, right? I mean, wouldn't you rather spend your time doing what you're doing now?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely different ways, but oh, absolutely. And I think, I mean, it's funny though because I would say there's enough money in the world, there's enough wealth. It's just not distributed
Yeah.
in a way that is is creating more sense making, right?
Yeah.
And I think that, many people tell me, Beth, people just want the easy button. Why, you're asking them to work. And I've never believed that. I think that, yes, people want the easy button. Yes, your brain is created to kind of go offline and not work at, it's always created to take the easiest route, to use the least amount of compute. And I'm like, why aren't we building, AI systems in the same way? Why are we trying to use large? I have a silly story. I had somebody who asked me to go around and measure other people's data lakes to make sure that they had the bigger one. And I couldn't make that up if I tried. It was like, really? Like, you want me to go? It's not difficult to say. It's not. If it was about the amount of parameters, for instance, Chinese has 330 million characters. Does that make them more intelligent? Or people who speak Chinese more intelligent? Like, come on. Like, this isn't about you're not thinking straight about what the outcomes could be. And when people are interacting with our AI system and they can see what source was used, why the system gave the answer, it does not require a lot of compute, and it doesn't even require hallucinations. And so you have a different path, is what I've been trying to give people an understanding of for a while.
That makes sense. I mean, getting back to the sort of ontology of it all and the sort of BAST model, part of what I
Hmm.
would imagine makes it sort of tricky or complicated is that like every organization contains multiple competing ontologies, right? Like the C-suite might have one map of how knowledge is organized, what counts as expertise, what relationships matter. Frontline workers might have another, IT
Hmm.
has another, like we could go on. And I would imagine these maps sort of like overlap to some degree, but rarely sort of completely. They reflect different positions and power structures and so forth. So, how do you go about mapping ontologies, knowing that there are both real stakes and sort of power
Hmm.
dynamics involved in determining whose ontology counts?
Fantastic question. And I'm going to preface all of this with, I am not a formal ontologist or a taxonomist, and there are people who are, and they are lovely, wonderful people. Go hire them because they have an understanding of the nature of reality that you need. The way that that I have always seen things is that you have to demand local expertise, whatever local means to you. And we're living in a day and age where the open structure is the person in the mailroom knows as much as the CEO. That's sort of like the common knowledge of the world. But there's another underlying social structure that nobody really sees or talks about. There's over 180 cognitive biases, and we were built to not work alone so that we would have other people see our own biases and be able to work together. We were never built to work in isolation because those cognitive biases are ancient shortcuts that we took in order to be able to make sense of the world, to run from the tiger. When when we look at, like, in the social bias that I was talking about earlier that people don't see, is that every organization mirrors their leader, hands down. You know, behaviorally, culturally, inauspiciously, like, I think that in ways that we understand social groups and organizations, we need to look at demographic studies. We need to look at network theory, social network analysis. We need to measure things like reciprocity, density, centrality. Like, you know, these are measurements that are not part of most companies' KPIs. But when you start to look at that culture, and I just read this article, so freaking good. It's about like the three market problem, which is just brilliant. One market is our commercial market, which is adversarial. People talk about the commercial market like we're at war with this company, competitive intelligence, you know, very, very competitive. And the other one is capital markets, where people adhere more like the weather, like, you know, the trade winds of the capital market today. You know, it's like it's weather. And then the third market is cultural. And that's a lot of what we've been getting into with ontology, is that we've inadvertently run into, well, IT says it's this, and the marketing says it's that, and the product person actually is the one who should be defining it. And he says that it's neither of those things. So it's fascinating. And I used to do this in consulting, is like, just imagine your C suite in a room together. And how often do you think that that really happens, where your CISO talks to your CIO, who talks to your CMO, who talks to your CTO, or, you know, how often do you think that happens?
Yeah, not all that often.
Yeah. It's insane how not often that that happens. And when you do and you pull in the CIO and the CISO, so your guy who's in charge of all of your technology, and that guy, he wants a fully articulated CMDB, or your configuration management database, that has every single system and it's accounted for, it's traceable, people know what it's connected to, all of these things, right? That's the CIO. And the CISO says, no freaking way am I going to give people a map to our crown
Right.
jewels. Absolutely not. And so, you know, get them together and they work and they figure out that their teams have been working against each other in an adversarial, competitive the entire time. And so it's like, when you start to map the words and the language, and, you know, the in the world of security, the screensavers that people use, that starts to then illuminate all kinds of things about your company and your culture. And there is no such thing as one freaking ontology to rule them all. One is not better than the other. One is more locally applicable than another. And that's something that we do have to figure out how to do better. But I think that the world is, I mean, not only are we ready for it, we are creating systems that are going to require local expertise, where people will not trust anything but the only trusted ecosystem, which is in person.
Right. Um, well, talk about some of the case studies that sort of Bast is coming across. Like, how is this alternative approach to AI like shifting outcomes in the healthcare context?
Uh, Honestly, and I will. It took us a year to get like an ROI at a university, and that was, you know, knowing that we went in very specifically, tried to find the problem. We found the problem. It was two classes attrition. We went in and said, okay, well, why are people, you know, attriting? And it was because these two classes were really difficult to study for. So we created an AI system that allowed people to study in ways that they could interact with the material. And what was really interesting is that they had forgotten what was on week 1 when the test covered week 1 through 6. So it was allowing people to interact with just the material for that test that they had forgotten because it was, 6 weeks ago. And that spread like wildfire by reducing attrition. Then we had to go and say, how much does it cost to get somebody at the top of the funnel? And then what's your conversion rate?
Right.
And then we could come up with an ROI. So, an ROI or an outcome in healthcare, what we're tracking right now is we're tracking usage to the goal in healthcare is the improvement of quality of life of the patient. And so the improvement of quality of life in the patient for an hospital, that means reduced readmission. That means higher quality of life because they don't need to come back to the hospital. And then that also means like reduced stay in hospitals. So more beds that are available to other patients because you're reducing the amount of time that somebody stays in the hospital. And the way that you reduce the amount of time somebody stays in the hospital is you train their caregiver to know what to expect, to know how to put their oxygen mask on first if they're a caregiver, and make sure that they don't pour from an empty cup, and really understanding the entire ecosystem of how that patient is living, and then being able to create accommodations through both human and wheelchair ramps or different accommodations. There's all kinds of amazing things that are out there, but it's very difficult to find if you're in the middle of Kansas. So how do you get this information to the very people who need it? And so it's a distribution based on good, high quality information, and then measurement over time. There's no, like, I'm not going to ever say I am going to take $6 billion out of this hospital's cost structure. We're really trying to help, and we're working with organizations that their goal, their mission is to improve the quality of life of a patient. And in doing so, we can do lots of things from a business side, but I would tell you that the most rewarding is really getting those caregivers to go, holy shit, if I had had this, I would have had a different quality of life for my father. And that's
That's really, yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, so switching gears just a little bit, you recently wrote a piece that I just loved on data as belongings. The idea that data, sort of to our earlier part of the conversation, they aren't just artifacts of social experience and interactions. They maintain a relationship with their communities of origin, that the ownership and meaning stay with the people who ancestors created them. Say more about what you mean by data as a belonging, and how does this sort of how is this reflected in how Bast goes about its work?
I evolved data as an artifact of human experience to data as a belonging after I visited a museum in Vancouver. And the museum archaeologist she's not an she's an anthropologist, and she made it clear that she's not an archaeologist. And she said, we like to see all of these things in our museum as the belongings of someone else. And so I just, it instantly clicked, because data can only ever belong to the creator in a way that it's hard to imagine in this world that has all of these incentive structures to be able to make human beings the product so that they can harvest the data and our data exhaust. What I think people don't realize, and this is a hard truth, is how much a small amount of information can say a lot about who somebody is. Sexual preference, religious preference, political preference, whether you're going to want that shirt in green as well as an orange, all of these things we can predict. And the one that I always send people back to, and it's 2015, 2016, is Jennifer Goldblatt. And she says, data scientists love curly fries. And so if you like curly fries, you might be a data scientist. So she does that with like the likes from Facebook, is like every time you like, there's this because of the amount of data that a lot of these companies have harvested, They have the ability to predict within a very high level of certainty who and what you might have preference for. The thing about it, and here's the good side about it, is human beings are mercurial. We change. Data is a flow. That's why it can only ever really belong to the creator. I mean, I have so many stories where, my favorite is my daughter, who I was really mad and I made her fill out like a form before a doctor's office, and we go back into the doctor's office and the doctor says, "So you are being treated for general anxiety and you've broken your ankle?" And I look at my daughter and I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And she's like, "Well, I have anxiety generally and my ankle hurts." So there's some form out there that says that she has general anxiety. And I've now told that story on many podcasts. So an AI system would have a frequency bias. And so some AI system might come up with the fact that my daughter has general anxiety and a broken ankle. That's why data can only belong to the creator. And that's why I think it's fascinating that people are not seeing this as the opportunity that it is, that it's an opportunity to really understand what is your point of view? What is your taste? And, what is taste? Like when you think about somebody's taste, what is that made up of? It's their experiences. And, you don't have certain experiences unless you have character. And like, what your character is made up with of is like how you were born, how you think, how you interact with other people. These behaviors that we have, become heuristics, become like, the next set of the cognitive biases, the next set of social interactions, the next set of things. And we do live in a world where I'm fascinated by the fact that, once a culture is popular, it's no longer popular culture. We're just we're in a magical time where we can start to see some of these things, and using an AI system to kind of highlight, the bias of the people who created it, as well as, what could possibly be your own bias. There's tons of prompts that you can do to say, what does this picture say about me? Or what does this picture say about this person? Or here, draw a picture of what you know about me. Every time I do it, it's always a dude. It always draws a guy. Just like that's it, that's a great way to show why AI doesn't understand the meaning of the words, right? Does it it I will be very specific. Generative AI that is using a GPT or generative pre-trained transformer model that doesn't understand the meaning of the words. It has a statistical understanding, but that's not real human understanding.
Right. Absolutely. Well, if an organization was sort of excited by or persuaded by this idea of treating data as a belonging, like what's one thing they could do starting tomorrow?
I think that they could start, talking and asking all of their people. Brene Brown does this when she goes into the organization. She looks for the people who have the least amount of power. They have the most data about what your culture is. And it is incredibly uncomfortable and it is not fun. But having that knowledge means that your organization can start to treat data as the belonging of your organization, and creating that alignment by including the people who have the least amount of power gives you, about the like inattentional blindness. Do you know that story? Greatest story. My friend Dave Snowden told me this, and I love him because he uses always female references in this case. So there were these two social scientists, and they wanted to determine whether people could pay attention to something and have an awareness of something else happening. So they put a bunch of people in a gym. They put a team with white t-shirts on, and had the one side of the gym count the number of baskets that the white t-shirt made, and then another team with the black t-shirts and count the number of baskets that the other thing. and then they walk a woman in a
Yeah.
gorilla suit
Yeah.
across the gym floor, and 80% of the people don't see the gorilla. Well, this gets even worse if you're an expert. So Dave Snowden put in a picture of a gorilla that was like 84 times the picture of cancer in a radiology report. And like the radiologists, even it was something like, 93% of them or whatever, don't put me on my stats, but like a huge amount of people didn't see the gorilla.
Right.
And this is why we were born to work in teams, is so that somebody else could pay attention to if there's a gorilla, and somebody else could pay attention to looking for the cancer, or like seeing the field instead of just the one thing. And we live in a world where we have propagated this idea of individualism and individual heroics, and the single 10x coder. But come on, that's such a brittle, stupid system. Why do we have one human,
Right.
a group of people seeing together? And think about what that would do for your organization. And this is not scientifically proven, but when you do know that, like, when you lose your vision, sometimes your hearing gets better, like your senses sort of compensate. And we do that in groups too. So if somebody is really good at writing documentation, somebody else is going to get really good at doing something else. And so working together is the key. And then building out an ontology. It doesn't even, you don't have to, there's no formalness to any of this. You can start to use that ontology, or the view of your reality, that comes from understanding what people's superpowers are. And I mean, working in very large corporations for as long as I have, Charlie, inevitably, somebody's like, actually, I'm like an app developer. I just do this PM thing because I'm good at it. But
Right.
what I really want to do is that. And I'm like,
Right.
inevitably. And that comes through talking to people, and understanding, what do they like to do? And what do they have an affinity for? And can we just slow down a hot minute and look at the amazingness of, like, making everybody a developer at this day and age, that they can develop something. Doesn't mean they should, but like they could. And so it's like we are in a world where we do have so many tools that are accessible and are available, and we're not, and everybody's afraid. And that's not, who is selling that, and what is their agenda? Because we're in a place where we get to do things that, and we're living longer, and by all means humanity is crushing it. It's just we're kind of pummeled right now by a lot of people who want to harvest our information, which is not the best use of it.
Well, if Bast works the way you intend, if data sort of starts to be treated more as a belonging, if ontology grounds our understanding, what does the AI landscape look like 10 years from now? Like, what's different from the one we're headed towards at the moment?
One of the largest difference that I want to see is a distribution of the work and the wealth. And so, from the wealth standpoint, right now, what is driving this AI economy is the harvesting of people's data without their consent, and the annotating of, or that the labeling of that data, from people who are getting paid, in Kenya in horrible conditions. Or, and that's where it's like, people are amassing billions of dollars from scraping data and having people in Kenya to annotate it. And it's like the worst James Bond awful movie that you could ever see, that is playing out. So imagine, somebody who has a tragedy, and they get an autoimmune disease, and they find out that, they have this disease, and they instantly start connecting to community, because if one person has a disease, likely another one of our 8 to 9 billion other human beings have something like it. And they start using that as information to not just cure the disease, but maybe just give a better quality of life. And then that person contributes their data, their belonging, to this reserve of information for the next person to come along, and they get compensated for that contribution. And I'm like, what a world
What a
in
world.
which, the stuff that we're made of, the stuff that we're thinking, and the stuff that we're doing, we get to choose whether we monetize that. And, that's technically possible today. There's nothing stopping us from doing that except for, the economy and the way that the systems are structured. But I think that that's really the distribution of the wealth, is that the data as belongings. Imagine a world where every single human being, their taste, their viewpoints, their information is accessible in a way that other people can choose to purchase that or not purchase that, or choose to want to benefit for that. I don't like the current economic system because it's really the study of scarcity, and that's a whole different podcast. But I think that there's things that we can think about from indigenous leaders, like Robin Wall Kimmerer writes about the gift economy, which is a very different economic system that comes from, she's a citizen of the Potawatomi Nation. And so it comes from her interactions with her culture. And, this idea of the gifts should always travel. And, there's lots of different ways to look at things in that world. Job sharing is kind of an idea of that, where it's like you had actors do jobs sharing when they have like a stunt double, right? That's job sharing effectively. So we can have these different ideas of gift economy, job sharing. Like there's lots of different models. And then that also is that distribution of the work too, because we can't I can't I just fathom how people are going to get through this latest demographic surge. And demographics are the only crystal ball that humans ever have. If you think differently, look at what happened with COVID. So human beings are complex adaptive systems. You do not predict what happens. You can really set the foundation for emergence, but that's a different paradigm. What we have in our world with like the job situation is we have more work, more people who are elderly, more people who are in this incredibly medieval, horrendous medical system that is tied to employment, that people have retired so they don't have employment. And when you're tying your health care to your job situation, you are creating massive problems for people. Like the incentives that you're creating is that, imagine a manager who really loves their company and wants to save money for their company, and they know that they have an employee that the insurance is costing X amount of dollars. That impacts that manager's brain, whether they like it or not. So we have to change some of these incentive structures to start incentivizing the behaviors that we want to see, because we have to start taking care of people. Nowhere in any time on earth have we been around more young people and old people in any lifetime in any humanity. Don't quote me, but like I think the average age in Roman times was like 22. The average age in like the 1700s was like 35. The average age in like 1960s was like 60 something, and now we're like at 82. What the hell? We have so many people who are so much older, living through different things, saying it was better when, or it will be good when. And we are not thinking about the amount of work that really creates in order to just cooperate as humanity. And that's what it blows my mind, where I'm, do you guys know how much work is coming? Like, is now? And how are we not making that, and I know the numbers, there's huge trillions of dollars if we actually compensated people for caregiving,
Yeah.
distribution of wealth and work.
Yep. I love it. Well, that feels like a good place to wind down. So the question I always end on is, what advice or wisdom would you offer your teenage self?
You know more than you think you know. You just don't have the words for it.
Hmm. I mean, that feels connected to Bast.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I was definitely the average 16-year-old that thought I knew everything, but knew I really didn't. And that it's so interesting, because I think that growing up as me, where I remember ATMs, checks, like, I remember all of these, like, sort of big transitions. I remember 1999, and, like, I think that there is something auspicious about being able to reflect back to our teenage selves and give ourselves a big break, because we didn't know then what we know now.
Couldn't agree more. Well, everyone should check out Bast AI and subscribe to Beth's great Substack, which is bastai.substack.com. I'll include a link in the show notes. Beth Rudden, thanks so much for coming on Untangled.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.